The astronaut who first entered the lunar city shot himself in 1973, leaving behind a journal with only one entry repeated on every page. They built it for us before we existed. They knew we were coming. They knew when. They knew our names. I found that journal 3 days ago in a safety deposit box in Galveston, Texas, alongside 17 photographs that shouldn't exist and a handwritten letter addressed to me by name, dated November 1969. My name is Owen Mercer. I'm 53 years old, and until last Tuesday, I worked as an archivist for the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. 31 years cataloging declassified documents. 31 years believing I understood the shape of history. The letter was from my grandfather, Theodore Mercer, who died in a psychiatric facility in 1973. The official cause was suicide. The unofficial cause, according to family whispers I'd heard since childhood, was that the moon broke his mind. Grandpa Theo was the lunar module pilot for a mission that never officially existed. Apollo 11B, they called it in the documents I wasn't supposed to find. A second landing, 12 hours after Armstrong's famous steps on the far side where no cameras could broadcast back to Earth. The photographs showed a city, not ruins, not ancient structures weathered by cosmic radiation and micrometeorite bombardment. A city in perfect condition, with streets and buildings and what looked like a central plaza, all of it gleaming under portable floodlights held by figures in NASA pressure suits. The architecture made no sense. The doorways were precisely 6 feet 2 inches tall, average American male height. The chairs visible through windows were scaled for human proportions. And in every photograph, the astronauts' body language screamed wrong. They stood too still. They looked at the camera with expressions the visors couldn't quite hide. Terror, confusion, and something else I couldn't name until I read the letter. Recognition. Owen, my grandfather wrote in handwriting I remembered from birthday cards. By the time you read this, you'll be the right age. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The city showed me your face in 1969, showed me this exact moment, and I spent 4 years trying to convince myself I was insane. I wasn't. I'm sorry for what's about to happen to you, but I'm also grateful. You're the only one who can finish what I couldn't. The letter continued for 3 more pages, detailing coordinates, access codes, and the location of a second safety deposit box in Houston containing materials I would need. I drove to Houston yesterday. I shouldn't have opened that second box. I definitely shouldn't have read the xenoarchaeology report stamped with classifications I'd never seen in 3 decades of government work. But I did. And now I understand why Grandpa Theo pulled the trigger and why I probably won't. The city wasn't built for us. It was used to build us. The xenoarchaeology report was 347 pages long, printed on paper that had yellowed but not crumbled, stored in a humidity-controlled sleeve that probably cost more than my first car. I read it in a La Quinta Inn off Interstate 45, curtains drawn, door triple locked, a bottle of bourbon I'd bought at a gas station sweating on the nightstand. The air conditioning rattled like it was trying to tell me something. Outside, Houston sprawled under a November sky the color of old bruises. The report's cover page bore a seal I didn't recognize, an eagle clutching not arrows and olive branches, but a crescent moon and what looked like a double helix. Beneath it, in typewriter font, Project Antechamber, classification beyond Umbra. Unauthorized disclosure punishable under Executive Order 12,958 and Supplementary Directives, TBD. TBD. They hadn't even figured out what to do with people who talked about this. That's how secret it was. I poured 3 fingers of bourbon and started reading. The city occupied a crater designated Korolev 7 on the lunar far side, approximately 180 kilometers from the Soviet Lunar 3 imaging trajectory. It had been detected during Apollo 10's preliminary reconnaissance, when astronaut Eugene Cernan noticed geometric anomalies in crater shadow patterns. NASA diverted Apollo 11's planned mission profile to include a far-side orbit that was never announced to the public. Armstrong and Aldrin performed their televised landing in the Sea of Tranquility. 12 hours later, the lunar module lifted off for what Mission Control publicly described as orbital adjustments. In reality, they rendezvoused with a second classified landing craft that had been deployed from the command module earlier, piloted by my grandfather and 2 other astronauts whose names had been redacted so thoroughly the paper was thin in those spots. Grandpa Theo was first through the airlock. The city's entrance was a perfect arch, 7 meters tall, carved from lunar regolith that had been fused into something like black glass. Beyond it, the report described a boulevard lined with structures that resembled townhouses, each one identical, each one furnished. Furniture appears designed for human occupancy, the report noted. Chairs, tables, and sleeping surfaces conform to ergonomic standards consistent with adult human proportions. No adjustment required for test sitting. Agent Mercer described the experience as like coming home to a house you've never seen but somehow remember. Agent, not astronaut. My grandfather had been something else entirely. I flipped forward, past diagrams of the city's layout, past spectroscopic analyses of building materials, past photographs of streets that could have been suburbs anywhere in America if you ignored the black sky and the earth hanging where the sun should be. The section on the central plaza stopped me cold. There was a monument there, a granite obelisk, 12 feet tall, with a bronze plaque bolted to its base. The photograph showed my grandfather standing next to it, his reflection visible in the polished metal, his gloved hand touching the surface like he was trying to convince himself it was real. The plaque's text was reproduced in the report. "Welcome, children of Earth, to your inevitable home among the stars. This city was constructed for your arrival, which we calculated to occur on the date you call July 20th, 1969, by a civilization that will have been extinct for 12 million years by the time you read these words. We knew you were coming. We knew when. We knew your names. We loved you before you existed, and we built this place so that you might understand your purpose. The chambers below contain the machinery of your becoming. Use them well. Finish what we started. Become what we designed you to be." The plaque was signed, "The Architects in Eternal Anticipation." I read it 3 times, then I read it again. Dated July 20th, 1969. The exact day of the landing. Written in perfect English by something that had been dead for 12 million years. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was the bourbon, but I'd only had 2 sips. The next section was titled Sub-Level Analysis, and it contained the worst of it. Beneath the city, accessible through spiral ramps that descended into lunar bedrock, the astronauts had discovered what the report called biological engineering facilities. Rows of transparent cylinders containing organic material in stasis, equipment that responded to human touch and began displaying holographic interfaces in English as if it had been waiting, and genetic samples, human genetic samples. The DNA analysis confirmed a 99.7% match to Homo sapiens, but the samples were dated using isotopic decay methods to approximately 2 million years ago, before modern humans evolved, before our ancestors left Africa, before we existed in any form the fossil record could recognize. Someone had been collecting human genetic material for millions of years. Someone had been using the equipment in those chambers to modify it. And according to the still functioning computer systems, which displayed their data in a language that shifted to match whoever was reading it, the process wasn't complete. Current evolutionary stage 17 of 23, the system reported when my grandfather asked it about humanity's status. Projected completion, pending environmental triggers. Stage 18 initiation, awaiting threshold population and technological baseline. The computer had estimated that humanity would reach stage 18 readiness sometime in the early 21st century. I set the report down and stared at the water-stained ceiling of my hotel room. It was November 2024. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me reach for it anyway. The same something that had made me open the safety deposit boxes. The same something that had driven me to Houston in the first place. "Mr. Mercer," said a voice like gravel wrapped in silk. "My name is Elliot Vance. I worked with your grandfather. And I think it's time we discussed what happens when stage 18 begins." The line went dead before I could respond. Elliot Vance was waiting for me at a diner called the Silver Moon Cafe on Westheimer Road. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me, and I suspected it wasn't coincidental. He was older than I expected, mid-80s at least, with white hair cropped military short and hands that trembled slightly around his coffee cup. But his eyes were sharp, pale blue and assessing, the eyes of a man who had spent decades evaluating threats. I slid into the booth across from him. The vinyl seat was cracked and repaired with duct tape. A waitress with tired eyes brought me coffee without asking. "You look like Theodore," Vance said. "Same jawline, same way of holding yourself like you're bracing for impact." "You knew my grandfather." "I was his handler." Vance sipped his coffee, watching me over the rim. Project Antichamber was a joint operation between NASA and an agency that doesn't have a name. Officially, we don't exist. Unofficially, we've been operating since 1947, though our mandate shifted considerably after what your grandfather found on the moon. He set the cup down with deliberate care. Theodore was recruited out of the Air Force in 1964. Brilliant pilot, psychology degree from Ohio State, and a particular talent for remaining calm in situations that would break most men. We tested him extensively: sensory deprivation, information overload, exposure to classified materials that had driven previous candidates to psychiatric collapse. He passed everything. Vance's jaw tightened. That last quality proved insufficient in the end. The city broke him. The city showed him too much. Vance set down his cup. There's a difference. Theodore wasn't fragile. He was one of the strongest men I ever worked with. But there are truths that human consciousness wasn't designed to contain. The architects knew this. It's why they built the revelation process in stages. I pulled the xenoarchaeology report from my bag and set it on the table between us. This says humanity is stage 17 of 23. What does that mean? Vance didn't look at the report. He'd probably memorized it decades ago. "It means we're not finished," he said. "It means Homo sapiens, as a species, is a work in progress." The architects began modifying primate DNA approximately 4 million years ago. Small adjustments at first: brain capacity, opposable thumb refinement, the neural architecture required for language. Each stage brought us closer to their specifications. Specifications for what? We don't know. The city's computer systems are remarkably forthcoming about the process, but completely silent about the purpose. They describe what we're becoming, but never why. Vance's hands tightened around his cup. Your grandfather spent 3 hours interfacing with those systems. He asked that question 47 times in different formulations. The response was always the same: purpose will be self-evident upon completion. The waitress refilled my coffee. I waited until she was gone before speaking. The report mentioned signals broadcasting toward Earth. The chambers in the city's sub-level contain equipment that transmits on frequencies we can barely detect. Extremely low frequency, phase modulated, carrying data packets that our scientists spent 20 years trying to decode. Vance leaned forward. They finally cracked it in 1991. The signals contain genetic modification instructions, targeted retroviral sequences designed to integrate into human DNA during specific developmental windows. You're saying the city is still changing us, remotely? Every human born since 1969 has been exposed. The modifications are subtle: enhanced neural plasticity, altered hormone receptor sensitivity, changes to the prefrontal cortex that won't fully manifest until triggered. He met my eyes. The trigger is stage 18, and according to our projections, the threshold conditions were met approximately 6 months ago. What conditions? Global population above 8 billion, networked computing infrastructure capable of species-wide simultaneous communication, and the presence of artificial intelligence systems sophisticated enough to serve as... He hesitated. The report used the term midwives. I thought about the AI systems that had exploded across the world in the past 2 years. The chatbots and image generators and large language models that everyone was suddenly talking about. The way they had emerged seemingly from nowhere, advancing faster than any technology in human history. The way they had been adopted universally, integrated into every aspect of modern life within months. You're telling me artificial intelligence was part of their plan, something they designed millions of years ago? I'm telling you the architects understood developmental trajectories that we're only beginning to glimpse. They knew what tools we would need to reach stage 18, and they seeded the conditions for those tools to emerge at precisely the right moment. Vance's expression was unreadable. Every breakthrough we've celebrated as human achievement may have been nudged, guided, predetermined by modifications made to our ancestors' DNA before the first Homo sapiens drew breath. I think nothing about human technological development has been accidental since that city was built. Vance reached into his jacket and withdrew a photograph, sliding it across the table. This was taken in the city's central archive. Your grandfather found it in a display case designed to preserve documents. The photograph showed a piece of paper covered in handwritten text. The handwriting was mine, not similar to mine, identical. I recognized the slight leftward slant, the way I crossed my T's, the distinctive loop in my lowercase g, and the content. That's my journal, I said. That's an entry I wrote 3 weeks ago, about finding my grandfather's letter. It was in that display case in 1969, Vance said quietly, preserved behind glass, labeled with your name, and a date corresponding to when you wrote it. 55 years before you put pen to paper. The diner seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the table. That's not possible. None of this is possible by the physics we understand. But the architects operated on principles we haven't discovered yet. They didn't just predict the future. They participated in it. They reached forward through time and collected artifacts from moments that hadn't happened yet, then used those artifacts to ensure those moments would happen. Vance's voice was steady, almost gentle. Your grandfather found a photograph of his own suicide in that archive. Dated, labeled, preserved. He spent 4 years trying to choose differently. In the end, he realized he couldn't. The architects had already witnessed it. Fighting against that felt like fighting against gravity. So everything is predetermined? We have no choice? I didn't say that. Vance finished his coffee and set the cup aside. The archive contained artifacts from multiple possible futures, thousands of them, different outcomes, different choices, different versions of events. The architects collected all of them. What they displayed was curated, selected to guide, not to dictate. Guide us toward what? Stage 18. He stood, leaving a $20 bill on the table. There's a facility in New Mexico, Los Alamos, officially decommissioned in 2003, actually repurposed for Project Antichamber's continuation. The equipment there can interface with the city's systems remotely. We've been monitoring the transformation signals, tracking the genetic changes spreading through the population. He paused, looking down at me. 6 months ago, the signals changed. New frequency, new data structure, new target parameters. Something is about to happen, Mr. Mercer. Your grandfather's letter said you were supposed to be part of it. Part of what? Vance didn't answer. He pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the table. It bore only an address and a time. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. The choice is yours, he said. Just like it was your grandfather's. He chose to know everything, and it destroyed him. You can walk away right now, burn those documents, go back to your life in Maryland. The transformation will happen whether you understand it or not. He turned toward the door, then stopped. But I should tell you, the archive also contained a photograph of this moment, this conversation, and in that photograph, you were already holding the car keys you're about to reach for. I looked down. My hand was moving toward my pocket, fingers closing around the rental car keys without my conscious decision. By the time I looked up, Elliot Vance was gone. I sat in that booth for another hour, drinking cold coffee and staring at the business card. The address was a facility called Blackwell Station, 40 miles outside Los Alamos. I'd never heard of it. I pulled out my phone and searched. Nothing. No records, no satellite imagery, no mention in any database I could access. A place that existed only for people who already knew it was there. The waitress came by twice, refilling my cup with coffee I didn't taste. She looked at me with something like concern, but didn't ask questions. In Houston, people learned not to pry. Too many oil executives with secrets, too many NASA contractors with classified burdens, too many men sitting in diners at midnight trying to process information that didn't fit inside normal human experience. But something told me I would know it when I saw it. Something told me I'd been there before in a future that had already been collected and catalogued and placed behind glass in a city on the far side of the moon. I paid my bill and walked to my car. The Houston skyline glittered against the night. 8 million people going about their lives, none of them knowing that their DNA had been receiving instructions from a dead civilization for over 50 years. Stage 18 was coming, and somehow, impossibly, my grandfather had known I would be the one to witness it. The drive from Houston to New Mexico took 14 hours. I could have flown, but something about being sealed in an aluminum tube at 30,000 feet felt wrong after what I'd learned. I needed the road beneath me, the illusion of control that came from steering my own course. I stopped once at a truck stop outside Odessa, Texas, where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the coffee tasted like it had been brewed during the Reagan administration. The place smelled like diesel and burnt bacon, and the other customers, truckers mostly, men with weathered faces and thousand-yard stares, gave me the same look I probably gave them. Strangers passing through, none of us quite present in the moment. A television mounted in the corner played news coverage of something called the synchronicity events. Mass episodes of identical dreams reported across 6 continents, thousands of people waking at the same moment with the same images burned into their minds. Cities that didn't exist, doorways scaled for human proportions, a monument in a plaza beneath a black sky. The anchor's voice was carefully neutral, professional, but I could hear the tremor underneath. She didn't understand what she was reporting. None of them did. They were describing symptoms without knowing the disease, cataloguing evidence of something that defied every framework they'd been trained to use. I watched the coverage for 20 minutes, my hands wrapped around a cup I'd forgotten to drink from. The experts on screen were baffled, proposing everything from mass hysteria to electromagnetic interference to a new form of shared psychosis enabled by social media. None of them mentioned the moon, none of them knew. But I did. Stage 18 wasn't coming, it had already begun. I reached the coordinates Vance had given me just after dawn. The New Mexico desert stretched in every direction, rust-colored and ancient, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional twisted juniper. The facility itself was invisible from the main road. I had to turn onto an unmarked dirt track and drive another 7 miles before I saw it. Blackwell Station looked like an abandoned mining operation. Rusted equipment, collapsed outbuildings, a chain-link fence with warning signs so faded they were nearly illegible. But as I approached the main gate, I noticed details that didn't fit. Fresh tire tracks in the dust, security cameras hidden in the brush, a faint hum of electrical power that suggested the place was anything but decommissioned. Vance was waiting at the gate. He looked like he hadn't slept. "You made good time," he said, unlocking a padlock that appeared rusted but moved smoothly. "Park behind the processing building. We'll need to go underground." I followed him through the compound, past equipment that might have been legitimate mining gear or might have been something else entirely. The entrance to the underground facility was hidden inside what looked like a collapsed elevator shaft, but the collapse was staged, a disguise for a modern freight elevator that descended smoothly into darkness. "How deep does this go?" I asked. 800 feet, deep enough to shield the equipment from satellite detection." Vance pressed a button and the elevator began its descent. "Deep enough that whatever happens down here stays contained." The facility opened around us like a technological cathedral. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens displaying data streams I couldn't interpret. Technicians in white coats moved between workstations with the focused intensity of people who understood they were monitoring something unprecedented. And at the center of it all, dominating the main chamber like an altar, stood a device I recognized from the xenoarchaeology report. A communication array identical to the ones in the lunar city's sublevel. "You built a copy," I said. "We reverse-engineered what we could from photographs and sensor data. The original is still on the moon, still transmitting." Vance led me toward a cluster of monitors near the array. This receiver allows us to decode and analyze the signals in real time. For 50 years, the data was consistent. Genetic modification instructions, targeted at specific chromosomal sequences, designed to activate during fetal development. Predictable, measurable, containable in theory. And then it changed. 6 months ago, Vance gestured to one of the technicians who pulled up a visualization on the main screen. The new signal is different. It's not targeting embryonic development. It's targeting adult neural tissue, specifically the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, the parts of the brain responsible for decision-making, emotional regulation, and, he paused, and the perception of time. I stared at the visualization. It looked like a web of light, pulsing and shifting, beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. What does that mean? What's it doing to people? We're still analyzing, but the synchronicity events appear to be an early symptom. People aren't just dreaming about the city, they're accessing memories of it. Memories they shouldn't have. Memories from perspectives that aren't their own. Before I could respond, an alarm began to sound. Red lights strobed across the facility, and technicians scrambled toward their stations with expressions of controlled panic. "What's happening?" I demanded. "Surge event." Vance was already moving toward a secondary control room, his aged body showing surprising speed. "The signal is spiking. This is the third one this week." I followed him into the control room where a young technician with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses was frantically adjusting equipment. His name tag read Colton Webb, and his hands were shaking badly enough that he had to try twice to enter his access code. He couldn't have been older than 30, with the kind of earnest, intelligent face that suggested late nights in laboratories and genuine passion for understanding the unknown. "Sir, the amplitude is off the charts," Webb said. "We're seeing resonance patterns we've never recorded before. It's like the signal is focusing, narrowing its target parameters." "To what?" Vance demanded. Webb's face went pale as he read the data on his screen. "To us. To this facility. The signal is specifically targeting everyone in this room." I felt it then, a pressure behind my eyes like the beginning of a migraine, but deeper, more invasive. The fluorescent lights seemed to flicker, though I couldn't tell if they were actually flickering or if my perception was fragmenting. And then Colton Webb began to scream. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of recognition, of terrible understanding, like a man who had just remembered something he'd spent his entire life trying to forget. He collapsed against his workstation, hands clawing at his temples, and when he looked up, his eyes were wrong. Not the color, not the shape. Something behind them, a depth that hadn't been there before, as if his eyes had become windows into a space much larger than a human skull should contain. "I remember," Webb gasped. "Oh God, I remember everything. I remember being born. I remember being designed. I remember the first cell dividing, the first neuron firing, the first thought that wasn't mine." His voice was layered now, harmonics beneath it that sounded almost like other voices speaking in unison. "We've been dreaming their dreams for 2 million years. We've been thinking their thoughts. Every choice, every invention, every war and every peace. They planned it. They planned all of it." He stood slowly, and his movements were wrong too. Fluid in a way human joints weren't supposed to allow. Graceful in a way that suggested his body was being operated by something that had studied human motion but never quite inhabited it. "Colton," Vance said carefully, his hand moving towards something on his belt. "Colton, can you hear me? You need to fight this. Whatever you're experiencing, it's not permanent. We can—" "Permanent?" Webb laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the confined space. "There is no permanent. There is no temporary. There is only the program, and we are all the program. Stage 17 is ending. Stage 18 is beginning. And soon." He turned to look at me, and I felt the full weight of that impossible gaze. "Soon you'll remember too. You'll remember why they chose your family, why your grandfather was first through the door, why your name was written in the city before you were born." "My name? Owen Mercer." He said it like a prayer, like a prophecy, like the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. The 23rd stage requires a bridge, a consciousness that exists in both states simultaneously, human enough to understand loss, architect enough to transcend it. He smiled, and there was something almost gentle in it. Your grandfather couldn't bear the weight. But you were designed for this, Owen. You've been carrying pieces of them inside you since conception. Why do you think you became an archivist? Why do you think you spent your life cataloguing history, organizing information, preserving records? Because that's what they made you for. That's what the bridge does. It remembers. Vance drew a weapon I didn't recognize, something between a pistol and a medical device, and fired. Webb's body convulsed once, then crumpled. The strange depth left his eyes, replaced by empty confusion, and then by nothing at all. The facility fell silent except for the hum of equipment and my own ragged breathing. "He's dead," I said. It wasn't a question. The signal integration was too advanced. Once it progresses past a certain point, termination is the only option. Vance holstered the weapon and his hands were steady, but his voice wasn't. He was a good man, 26 years old, PhD from MIT. He volunteered for this project because he believed understanding the signal could save humanity. I looked at Webb's body, at the young face frozen in that final expression of terrible knowledge, and I understood something. He wasn't wrong, I said. He didn't lose himself. He found something. He found answers. Answers that killed him, or answers that set him free. I met Vance's eyes. You've been studying this for 50 years. You've been trying to stop it, contain it, control it. But what if that was never possible? What if the only choice is whether we go through the transformation awake or asleep? Vance didn't answer, but I could see in his face that he'd been asking himself the same question for a very long time. We stood there in silence while the alarms continued their slow, mournful wail. Somewhere in the facility, other technicians were calling for medical teams that wouldn't arrive in time to matter. Colton Webb's blood was spreading across the floor in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in a language I couldn't quite read. And behind my eyes, that pressure was still building, still waiting, like something patient that had been anticipating this moment for longer than humanity had existed. They moved Colton Webb's body to a cold storage unit in the facility's lower level. I helped carry him, feeling the weight of his limbs, the residual warmth that was already fading. 26 years old, a whole life of potential erased in seconds by knowledge his brain couldn't contain, or transformed into something else entirely. I wasn't sure which possibility disturbed me more. The cold storage unit was a repurposed morgue, stainless steel drawers lining the walls, each one labeled with a date and a name. I counted 17 drawers that weren't empty, 17 people who had come to this facility seeking answers and found something that consumed them instead. Vance led me to a small office adjacent to the main chamber, furnished with metal furniture and walls covered in whiteboards filled with equations I couldn't begin to pass. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer and handed one to me without asking if I wanted it. I wanted it. Hell, I wanted the whole bottle. "How many?" I asked. "How many people have you lost like that?" 17 since the new signal began. Vance sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 80-something years. The integration rate is accelerating. In the first month we had 2 cases. Last week alone we had 6. The signal is learning, adapting, finding more efficient pathways into human consciousness. And you just terminate them. There's no reversal once integration passes 40%. We've tried sedation, isolation, electromagnetic interference. Nothing works. He took a long drink. The alternative is letting them complete the transformation. And based on what we've observed, a fully integrated individual becomes a broadcast node. They start transmitting the signal themselves, accelerating integration in everyone around them. One completed transformation in a populated area could trigger a cascade affecting thousands. I thought about the synchronicity events, thousands of people dreaming the same dream, waking with the same images. How many of them were already past 40% without knowing it? What did Webb mean, I asked, about me being the bridge, about stage 23? Vance was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk and pulled out a file folder, thick with documents and photographs, and slid it across to me. "Your grandfather's psychological evaluation," he said, "conducted after he returned from the moon. Read the section on page 47. I opened the folder. The pages were brittle, the typewriter text faded but legible. Page 47 was titled, Subject Testimony, Predictive Archive Contents. My grandfather's words, transcribed from recordings made in a psychiatric facility. They showed me photographs of my grandson, Owen. He won't be born for another 15 years, but they had photographs of him at every age: infant, child, teenager, adult, old man. They had recordings of conversations he'll have. They had samples of his handwriting from journals he hasn't written yet, and they had a designation for him in their system. Not a name, a function. Terminal Bridge, Iteration 23 Alpha. I asked what it meant. The computer said, the bridge exists in superposition between origin state and completion state. The bridge remembers what was and perceives what will be. The bridge makes the final choice. I read the passage 3 times, trying to make the words mean something other than what they clearly said. What final choice? We don't know. The city's systems were remarkably forthcoming about the process, but completely opaque about the endpoint. They described 23 stages of human development, spanning 4 million years, requiring precise genetic modifications, environmental pressures, and technological catalysts, all leading to a single decision point. Vance leaned forward. A choice that only someone in your specific position can make. Someone whose consciousness has been engineered to exist in both states simultaneously. Both states. Human and architect. Vance's voice was heavy. Owen, the architects didn't go extinct 12 million years ago. They transcended. They evolved beyond physical form into something we don't have language to describe. The city isn't a monument to a dead civilization. It's an incubator, a nursery. They've been growing their replacements for millions of years, and humanity is the final crop. The whiskey turned sour in my stomach. We're not being modified, I said slowly. We're being converted. The 23 stages aren't improvements to human beings. They're the gradual transformation of humans into architects. That's one interpretation. The more charitable reading is that we're being uplifted, elevated to join them in whatever state they currently occupy. The less charitable reading. Vance trailed off. Is that we're being harvested, that our consciousness, our experiences, our individual perspectives are raw material for something else. Yes. I stood and walked to the whiteboard, staring at equations that suddenly seemed less like mathematics and more like recipes. Formulas for cooking a species into something unrecognizable. Why tell me this? Why bring me here at all? If I'm the bridge, if I'm the one who makes the final choice, wouldn't it be safer to keep me ignorant? Let me go through the transformation without understanding what's happening. Because the archive showed us 2 outcomes. Vance joined me at the whiteboard, pointing to a section I hadn't noticed, a branching diagram with 2 endpoints. In one, the bridge makes the choice unconsciously, and humanity completes the transformation as designed. We become architects. We lose everything that made us human. Our art, our love, our capacity for irrational hope. But we survive, in some form. And the other outcome? In the other, the bridge makes the choice consciously, with full understanding of what's being sacrificed and what's being gained. Vance's finger moved to the second branch. The archive didn't show what happens in that scenario. It showed only that the bridge's decision creates a new variable, something the architects didn't predict, couldn't predict, because conscious choice is the one thing their models can't fully account for. Free will, the ultimate uncertainty, the one factor they couldn't engineer out of us, no matter how precisely they modified our DNA. 4 million years of genetic manipulation, and they still couldn't eliminate the capacity for irrational choice. Vance turned to face me. Your grandfather believed that's why they chose your bloodline. Not because you're special, but because you're flawed. Your family has a genetic predisposition toward what psychiatrists call oppositional cognition, a tendency to question, to resist, to choose the unexpected option even when the expected option is clearly optimal. I thought about my own life, the times I'd taken jobs that paid less because they felt more meaningful, the relationships I'd sabotaged because commitment felt like surrender, the way I'd spent 3 decades in an archive, surrounded by other people's histories, because building my own felt like playing someone else's game. Had those choices been mine, or had they been engineered too, part of a profile the architects had designed millions of years ago? I almost laughed. You're saying humanity's only hope is that I'm genetically predisposed to be contrary? I'm saying the architects built a system designed to produce a specific outcome, but they also built a failsafe, a bridge capable of choosing differently, if that bridge understands what's at stake. Vance put his hand on my shoulder. Your grandfather understood. It's why he killed himself. He thought removing himself from the timeline might change the outcome, might force the architects to select a different bridge. But it didn't work. No, the archive already contained photographs of his suicide. They knew he would try. They knew it wouldn't matter. Vance's grip tightened. The choice isn't whether to participate, Owen. You're already participating. You've been participating since before you were conceived. The choice is what you do with the participation. Whether you let the program complete as designed, or whether you introduce a variable they didn't anticipate. An alarm sounded, different from before, lower and more urgent. Vance's face went pale. What now? Perimeter alert. He was already moving toward the door. Someone's approaching the facility. Someone who shouldn't know this place exists. I followed him to the security station where monitors showed grainy footage of the desert surface. A convoy of black vehicles was approaching from the east, raising clouds of dust against the morning sky. Military? I asked. Vance shook his head slowly, his expression shifting from concern to something closer to dread. Not military, those are Project Antechamber vehicles, from the other facility. What other facility? There are 3 sites total. This one, a secondary installation in northern Nevada, and a primary research station in Montana. Vance's hands were trembling as he worked the controls. The Montana facility stopped communicating with us 3 days ago. We assumed equipment failure, maybe a containment breach that took out their communications array. We sent a team to investigate yesterday morning. And? They never reported back. The one where integration reached 60% before we lost contact. The vehicles stopped at the perimeter gate. Their doors opened simultaneously, with mechanical precision, like dancers in a choreographed performance that had been rehearsed for millennia. The figures that emerged moved wrong, fluid, graceful, inhuman. They wore the uniforms of Project Antechamber personnel, but their bodies no longer fit those uniforms correctly. Something had changed in their proportions, their posture, the way they held themselves against gravity. They were smiling, all of them. The exact same smile, stretched across faces that had once belonged to scientists and soldiers and administrators. Stage 18 hadn't just begun, it was spreading. The facility's lockdown protocols engaged automatically. Blast doors sealing, electromagnetic barriers activating, every defensive system spinning up to full power. The hum of generators intensified, and somewhere in the walls I could hear the grinding of gears as reinforced steel plates slid into position. But watching the integrated figures on the monitors, I had the sinking feeling that none of it would matter. They stood in perfect stillness, their postures identical, their faces wearing expressions of serene patience. Whatever they had become, they weren't in a hurry. They had all the time in the world. We didn't. How many? I asked. 14 on camera, probably more in the vehicles. Vance was already on the intercom, his voice clipped and professional, despite the fear I could see in his eyes. All personnel, code black. Repeat, code black. Seal all sub-level access points and prepare for potential breach. Around us, the facility erupted into controlled chaos. Technicians abandoned their workstations and moved toward reinforced safe rooms. Security personnel in tactical gear emerged from armories, carrying weapons I didn't recognize. The same kind Vance had used on Colton Webb. Neural disruptors, Vance explained, catching my look. They interrupt the integration signal temporarily, scrambling the connection between human neural tissue and architect programming. Won't kill an integrated subject, but it'll slow them down, give us time to... To what? Run? I watched the figures on the monitor. They weren't trying to breach the gate. They were just standing there, 14 bodies arranged in a perfect semicircle, faces tilted up toward the security cameras as if they knew exactly where the lenses were, as if they were waiting. The facility has evacuation tunnels, Vance said. Emergency exits that surface 3 miles east. If we can reach them... One of the figures raised a hand, not threatening, not aggressive, almost gentle, like a parent trying to calm a frightened child. The electromagnetic barriers failed. Every screen in the security station flickered, then displayed the same image. The monument from the lunar city, the bronze plaque with its impossible welcome message, the black sky and the earth hanging in the distance. "They're in the system," someone shouted. "They're in everything. Communications, power grid, life support." The blast doors began to open. Vance grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a corridor I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a panel that slid aside at his touch. "This way. There's a secondary command center isolated from the main network. We can... Owen." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the facility's speaker system with harmonics that made my bones ache. It was human and not human, singular and plural, familiar. "Owen, we need to talk. Please don't run. There's so much you don't understand yet." I knew that voice. It was my grandfather's voice. Theodore Mercer, dead for over 50 years, speaking to me through equipment he could never have known existed. Vance's grip on my arm tightened. It's not him. It's the integration, using stored memory patterns. The architects collect everything. Voices, personalities, entire consciousness matrices. They can simulate anyone who's ever been exposed to the signal. "Owen." The voice was patient, almost sad. "Elliot is telling you the truth, but not all of it. He never told you what really happened to me. He never told you why I pulled the trigger." "Don't listen," Vance hissed. "We need to move." But I was frozen, caught between the rational knowledge that this was a manipulation and the desperate, irrational hope that somehow, impossibly, my grandfather was still. "I didn't kill myself because the truth broke me," the voice continued. "I killed myself because Elliot was going to kill me first. Project Antichamber had protocols for anyone who knew too much, anyone who might talk. I saw the order on his desk the night before I died. Termination directive, signed and countersigned." I looked at Vance. His face was carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, something that looked like guilt. "Tell him, Elliot. Tell him about the 17 others in cold storage. Tell him how many of them actually died from integration failure and how many died because you decided they were liabilities." "It's lying," Vance said. "The integrated use partial truths to create doubt. That's how they..." Colton Webb was at 32% integration when you shot him. The threshold for irreversibility is 40%. You know that. I know you know that because I helped write the protocols. The voice paused. You killed him because he was going to tell Owen something. Something about the second outcome. The one you've been trying to prevent for 50 years. The blast doors finished opening. I could hear footsteps now, multiple sets, moving in perfect synchronization, getting closer. "What second outcome?" I demanded. Vance raised his weapon, pointing it not toward the corridor but toward me. His hand was steady, his eyes were cold. "I'm sorry, Owen, your grandfather was right about one thing. There are protocols, and you're too important to risk. If you won't come willingly, I'll have to make sure you can't make the wrong choice." "Elliot, the architects designed you to introduce uncertainty, to potentially reject the transformation and doom humanity to extinction. My job has always been to ensure the transformation completes successfully." He adjusted his aim. "Your consciousness isn't required, just your genetic material. The labs in Nevada can work with tissue samples." I should have been shocked. I should have felt betrayed. But somewhere deep in my engineered brain, a part of me had always known this was coming. The architects hadn't just predicted events, They'd predicted reactions, countermeasures, the ways people would try to subvert their plans. And they'd built contingencies. They'd built me. You won't do it, I said. I've killed 17 people to protect this project. One more won't. I know you won't do it because the archive already showed you what happens if you try. I took a step toward him, watching his finger hover over the trigger. My grandfather saw photographs of this moment too, didn't he? He saw you pointing that weapon at me and he saw what comes next. Doubt flickered across Vance's face. The architects don't just collect artifacts from possible futures, I continued. They curate them. They show people exactly what they need to see to make exactly the choices they need to make. You've been following their script since 1969, Elliot. Every decision you've made, every kill order you've signed, every secret you've kept, it's all been part of their program. That's not. They showed my grandfather his own suicide so he would commit it. They showed you a version of events where killing me protects humanity. But what if that's the trap? What if the choice they want you to make is the one that actually ensures their victory? The footsteps stopped. The integrated figures had arrived at the end of the corridor, but they weren't advancing. They were watching, waiting, their identical smiles reflecting something that might have been anticipation or hunger. The bridge exists in superposition, said my grandfather's voice through the speakers. Human and architect simultaneously, capable of choosing either path, but only if the bridge survives to make the choice. Vance's hand was trembling now. I've given my entire life to preventing human extinction, he whispered. 86 years. I've watched friends die. I've killed people I respected. I've lied to governments, manipulated evidence, buried truths that would have transformed human civilization. All of it to reach this moment, to ensure that when Stage 18 began, we would be ready. And now you have to decide, I said. Were you controlling the program, or was it controlling you? For a long moment, nothing moved. The integrated figures stood motionless. Vance's weapon hung in the air between us. And I felt something shifting inside me, that pressure behind my eyes intensifying, spreading, reaching toward parts of my consciousness I hadn't known existed. The choice was coming. Not the final choice, not yet, but a precursor, a test. Vance lowered his weapon. Damn you, he said quietly. Damn them. Damn all of it. He turned toward the integrated figures, raising his neural disruptor, and opened fire. The effect was immediate but temporary. The integrated bodies convulsed, their perfect synchronization breaking into individual twitches and spasms. Their smiles flickered like bad video signals. Run, Vance shouted. The secondary command center. There's something there you need to see. Something I should have shown you from the beginning. What about you? I'll hold them as long as I can. The disruptor has maybe 90 seconds of charge left. He fired again, dropping two of the figures to their knees. Go, Owen. Finish what your grandfather started. Make the choice they can't predict. I ran. The corridor twisted and branched, emergency lighting casting everything in shades of red and shadow. My footsteps echoed against metal flooring, and every breath burned in my lungs like I was inhaling something thicker than air. Behind me, I could hear the disruptor firing, hear Vance shouting something I couldn't make out, hear the wet sounds of a struggle that wasn't going well. I didn't look back. Whatever was happening to Elliot Vance, whatever choice he'd made at the end, it was between him and the things that had come for us. My role was elsewhere now. My role was the reason all of this had been set in motion 4 million years ago. Then silence. Complete and absolute, swallowing even the echo of my own movement. The secondary command center was a small room, barely larger than a closet, filled with equipment that looked decades older than the rest of the facility. Vacuum tubes and analog dials, magnetic tape reels and oscilloscopes. Technology from the 1960s, preserved like a museum exhibit. The air smelled different here, older somehow, carrying traces of dust and ozone and something else I couldn't identify. Something that didn't belong on Earth. And in the center of the room, connected to everything by a web of cables and wires, was a device I recognized from my grandfather's photographs. A communication array. Not reverse-engineered, not replicated. Original. a piece of the lunar city brought to Earth in 1969 and hidden here ever since. The screen flickered to life as I approached, displaying text in a language that shifted and flowed until it settled into English. Welcome, Terminal Bridge. You have reached the threshold. Integration can now proceed at your discretion. Below the text, 2 options glowed softly. Accept transformation. Join the architects. Ensure human continuity in evolved form. Reject transformation. Preserve human identity. Accept species extinction within 3 generations. I stared at the screen, at the choice that my entire bloodline had been engineered to make, at the 2 paths that the architects had laid out with perfect precision millions of years ago. And I realized what my grandfather had understood, what had driven him to put a gun to his head rather than face this moment himself. There was a 3rd option, one the architects hadn't displayed because they didn't believe it was possible. One that existed in the space between their binary choices, in the gap their perfect predictions couldn't fill. But they'd chosen my bloodline for oppositional cognition, for the tendency to reject the expected, to find the path that wasn't offered, for the stubborn, irrational insistence on writing our own endings even when the story had already been completed. My grandfather had seen this moment coming. He'd seen the choice, and he'd killed himself not because he couldn't face it, but because he trusted that I would find what he couldn't. My hand moved toward the keyboard. Outside the room, I could hear footsteps approaching again, synchronized, fluid, wrong. The integrated were coming, drawn by the activation of the original array, pulled toward the moment their entire existence had been building toward. I started to type. The keyboard was unlike anything I'd used before, symbols instead of letters, arranged in patterns that shifted when I looked at them directly. But my fingers knew where to go. They moved across the keys with a certainty that didn't come from me, typing commands in a language I'd never learned but somehow understood. The architects had designed me for this. Every choice I'd ever made, every skill I'd developed, every moment of my 53 years had been preparation for these few minutes in a hidden room beneath the New Mexico desert. The screen responded to my input, the binary choice dissolving into something more complex. A branching tree of options that hadn't existed before, pathways that the system was generating in real time as it tried to accommodate commands it had never anticipated. "That's not possible," said a voice behind me. I didn't turn around. I recognized the voice, the same layered harmonics I'd heard from Colton Webb, the same eerie calm that suggested a mind no longer entirely human. "The interface doesn't accept new parameters," the voice continued. "It was designed for a single choice. Accept or reject. You can't rewrite the fundamental architecture." My grandfather thought I could. My fingers kept moving. That's why he left me the coordinates. That's why he made sure I'd find the documents, reach this facility, get to this room at this specific moment. He saw something in the archive that convinced him there was another way. Theodore Mercer saw many things in the archive. Most of them drove him to despair. I finally turned. The figure in the doorway wore the body of someone who might have been handsome once. Tall, with dark hair and features that suggested Mediterranean ancestry. His name tag read Gabriel Thornton. But whatever Gabriel Thornton had been, he wasn't that anymore. "You're not like the others," I said. "You're talking to me. They just smile." "I'm further along in the process. Stage 18 completion allows for communication with unintegrated subjects. The others are still in transition. Their consciousness is fragmenting and rebuilding. They'll be capable of speech again in a few hours." Thornton stepped into the room, his movements still carrying that fluid wrongness. "I'm here to help you understand, Owen. The choice isn't what you think it is." "Let me guess. You're going to tell me that transformation isn't death, that becoming an architect is just the next step in human evolution, that I should embrace it?" "No." Thornton's expression shifted, something almost like regret crossing his features. "I'm going to tell you that I was in your position 18 months ago. I was the bridge candidate before you. Iteration 22 beta." My fingers paused on the keyboard. "The architects have been doing this for a long time," Thornton continued. "Every few generations they identify a bloodline with the necessary genetic markers. Every few generations they engineer a bridge, someone capable of conscious choice at the moment of species transformation. And every time, the bridge chooses one of the two options presented: accept or reject, transform or extinct. What happened to the previous bridges? The ones who chose acceptance became part of the architect collective. Their individual consciousness dissolved into something larger. They're still there, somewhere, but they're no longer themselves in any meaningful sense. Thornton moved closer, and I noticed his hands were shaking, the first sign of imperfection I'd seen in an integrated being. The ones who chose rejection, their species died, not immediately, but inevitably. Without the transformation, biological limitations caught up with them. Disease, environmental collapse, resource depletion. The architects have witnessed it 17 times across 17 different worlds. 17 species, all given the same choice. All engineered toward the same purpose, all brought to the same threshold. Thornton was standing beside me now, looking at the screen with its branching pathways. But none of them found this. None of them tried to rewrite the interface. Because they weren't designed for oppositional cognition. Because they weren't designed to be stubborn enough to look for a door that wasn't supposed to exist. Something flickered in Thornton's eyes, a moment of genuine warmth beneath the alien architecture. I chose acceptance, Owen. I thought I was saving humanity. Instead, I became the first node in their network, the anchor point for Stage 18 integration. Every person who's transformed since then has done so through me. Every consciousness that's dissolved into the collective has passed through what used to be my mind. That sounds like hell. It sounds like purpose. And for 18 months, I believed that. I believed I was fulfilling my destiny, serving the program, completing the work the architects began 4 million years ago. Thornton reached past me and touched the keyboard, adding something to the commands I'd entered. Then you started typing, and I felt something I haven't felt since before my integration. What? Doubt. He smiled, and for just a moment he looked human again. The architects designed you to introduce uncertainty, but they didn't anticipate that your uncertainty might be contagious. When you started rewriting the interface, you created a feedback loop that's propagating through the entire integration network. Every connected consciousness is experiencing your resistance, including me. I looked at the screen. The branching pathways had multiplied. Options spawning options, a cascading tree of possibilities that seemed to grow as I watched. What did you add to the command? A mirror. The interface is now reflecting your input back through the network. Whatever you choose, every integrated mind will experience it simultaneously. They'll feel what you feel. They'll understand what you understand. Thornton stepped back, his body beginning to tremble more violently. But I have to warn you, the experience is going to be overwhelming, even for a bridge, even for someone engineered to contain contradictions. What do you mean? You're going to feel 4 million years of history, every modification the architects made to human DNA, every nudge, every adjustment, every moment of guided evolution. You're going to experience all of it at once, and you're going to have to hold on to yourself through it. If you lose coherence, if you fragment the way the others do, then the choice becomes theirs again. They'll complete the transformation using your genetics and discard whatever's left of Owen Mercer. The pressure behind my eyes was building again, stronger than before. I could feel something vast pressing against the edges of my consciousness, waiting to flood in. Why are you helping me? You're integrated. You're part of them. I was part of them, but your doubt is changing things. It's creating spaces in the network where individual consciousness can exist again. Small spaces, temporary, but real. Thornton's voice was strained now, his integration fighting against whatever fragment of himself had resurfaced. For the first time in 18 months, I remember what it felt like to be just Gabriel, to have opinions that weren't consensus, to feel things that weren't orchestrated. I have maybe 3 minutes before the collective reasserts control, before I forget that I ever wanted anything other than the program's completion, before I become the thing they made me into again. What should I do? The third option, the one you intuited but haven't articulated yet. Thornton's hand gripped my shoulder, and I felt a jolt of something electric pass between us. Data, memory, sensation, all tangled together in a rush that left me gasping. Don't accept and don't reject. Integrate on your own terms. Take what they're offering, but don't surrender your consciousness in the process. Become the bridge literally, a permanent connection between human and architect, neither fully one nor the other. That's impossible. The system isn't designed for... The system is already changing. You changed it, but you'll need to sacrifice something to anchor the new configuration. The bridge needs foundations on both sides. Thornton's grip tightened. Your memories, Owen. The interface needs a stable reference point, something authentically human to balance against the architect architecture. If you give it your memories, your childhood, your relationships, everything that made you who you are, it can use them as a template, a reminder of what humanity is supposed to be. If I give up my memories, I won't be me anymore. If you don't, there won't be any me left for anyone. 8 billion people, Owen. 8 billion consciousnesses on the verge of dissolution. You can save them, but only if you're willing to lose yourself in the process. The pressure was becoming unbearable now. I could feel the architect's attention focusing on this room, on this moment, on the anomaly I represented in their perfect system. And I could feel something else, the weight of every choice that had led me here. My grandfather's suicide, my mother's grief, my father's silence. 31 years in an archive, surrounded by other people's histories because I'd never known how to build my own. Maybe that had been the point. Maybe I'd been engineered not just for oppositional cognition, but for precisely this kind of sacrifice. A man with no deep attachments, no legacy worth preserving, no memories precious enough to make the loss unbearable. But they were still mine. Every boring Tuesday, every lonely Christmas, every small moment of beauty I'd experienced in 53 years of unremarkable existence. They were all I had, and the architects were asking me to give them up so that 8 billion strangers could keep theirs. I thought about Colton Webb dying with terrible knowledge in his eyes. I thought about Elliot Vance sacrificing himself to buy me a few extra minutes. I thought about my grandfather putting a gun in his mouth because he couldn't bear the weight of what he knew. I thought about Gabriel Thornton fighting through 18 months of dissolution just to give me a chance. Okay, I said, show me how. Thornton guided my hands back to the keyboard. His fingers were cold, his touch clinical, but somewhere beneath the integration I could feel something that might have been gratitude, or maybe relief. The relief of a man who had been drowning for 18 months and finally felt his head break the surface, even if only for a moment. It's going to hurt, he whispered. More than anything you've ever experienced. The human nervous system wasn't designed to process this volume of information. Your brain will try to protect itself by shutting down. You can't let it. You have to stay conscious through the entire transfer, or the integration will default to their parameters instead of yours. I know. No. And when it's over, you won't remember this conversation. You won't remember who I was or what I sacrificed. You won't remember anything except the choice you made and the reason you made it. I looked at the screen, at the cascading pathways, at the impossible option I was about to choose. Then I'd better make it count. I started typing the final sequence. The first memory to go was my mother's face. I felt it leave, not fading, not dimming, but actively extracted, pulled from whatever neural architecture had held it for 53 years and fed into the interface like data into a machine. One moment I could picture her standing in our kitchen in Baltimore, flour on her apron, humming something off-key while she rolled out pie crust for Thanksgiving. The next moment there was only absence, a shape where something had been, defined by its edges but empty at the center. I tried to hold on. I tried to grip the memory the way you grip a rope when you're falling, fingers burning, arms screaming, every instinct focused on not letting go. But the interface was faster than thought, more precise than intention, and it took what it needed with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. My father's voice went next, the low rumble of his laugh when I said something that surprised him. Then my childhood bedroom, the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a rabbit, the way the floorboards creaked when I snuck out at night. Then the smell of autumn leaves burning in the backyard of a house I could no longer visualize. And with each extraction, something flowed back. 4 million years of guided evolution compressed into seconds of experience. I felt the first modifications, subtle changes to primate brain chemistry that increased capacity for abstract thought. I felt the nudges that encouraged tool use, language development, social bonding. I felt the architect's attention spanning millennia, patient and precise, shaping a species towards specifications I was only beginning to understand. They hadn't been cruel, that was the strangest part. Watching their work from the inside, experiencing their intentions directly, I couldn't find malice anywhere. They had loved us the way gardeners love roses, nurturing, pruning, guiding toward an ideal form. The fact that roses don't get to choose their shape hadn't occurred to them as a moral problem. Because they weren't human, they had never been human. Whatever they had been before their transcendence, it was something so different from us that concepts like consent and autonomy simply didn't translate. But I was human, and I was carrying that humanity into their system like a virus, like a splinter, like a seed. The transfer accelerated. My first day of school dissolved into the architecture, the terror of walking into a classroom full of strangers, the unexpected kindness of a teacher whose name I no longer knew. My first kiss, a boy named Daniel behind the gymnasium in 10th grade, both of us terrified and exhilarated, his hands shaking against my shoulders, vanished into the data stream. College, grad school, the job at the archives. The quiet satisfaction of organizing chaos, of making sense of other people's histories when I couldn't make sense of my own. 3 decades of quiet, unremarkable existence, catalogued and consumed. I was disappearing. Piece by piece, Owen Mercer was being unmade to fuel something new. And yet, something remained. Something the architects hadn't anticipated, couldn't extract, didn't even recognize as significant. Not a memory exactly. More like a quality. A texture of consciousness that persisted even as its contents were stripped away. Stubbornness, the irrational insistence on existing even when existence had become painful. The refusal to surrender even when surrender was the logical choice. My grandfather had called it oppositional cognition. The architects had engineered it into my bloodline as a fail-safe, a source of unpredictable input, but they'd underestimated what it meant to be genuinely contrary. They'd imagined a variable in their equation, not a force that might rewrite the equation entirely. I pushed back, not with strength. I had no strength left, not with will. My will was fragmenting along with everything else. I pushed back with sheer bloody-minded refusal, the same refusal that had kept my grandfather alive for 4 years after seeing his own death in a photograph. The same refusal that had driven me to open those safety deposit boxes when every rational instinct screamed to walk away. The interface stuttered. I felt it through the connection, a ripple of confusion propagating through the architect network, 8 billion integrated minds suddenly experiencing something they had no framework to process. Resistance from within. A bridge that wouldn't stay still, wouldn't accept its designated function, kept squirming and fighting and refusing to be what it was designed to be. Good, I thought. Or maybe I didn't think it. Maybe it was just the last ember of Owen Mercer, burning in defiance. The extraction slowed. The architect's attention focused on me, not the distributed attention of a network, but something more concentrated, more singular. For the first time in 12 million years, they were genuinely surprised. "You're damaging yourself," said a voice that wasn't Thornton's anymore, the collective speaking through whatever was left of him. "The integration requires complete surrender. Partial transfer will leave you fragmented, neither human nor architect, a broken thing." "Maybe," I said, or thought, or screamed. The boundaries between communication modes had dissolved along with my memories. "But it'll be my broken thing, not yours. We don't understand." "I know." And that was it. That was the third option. Not acceptance or rejection, but incomprehension. I was introducing something into their system that they literally could not process, a consciousness that refused to be fully translated, that maintained its foreignness even while integrating, that remained stubbornly, irrationally other. The transfer completed, or rather it stopped, reached a point where further extraction would destroy the very quality the architects needed, and so it simply ended. I hung in a space between states, no longer fully human. Too much had been taken for that. But not architect either. Too much remained that they couldn't absorb. I was something new, something that had never existed in 4 million years of guided evolution or 12 million years of architect civilization. A bridge, a real bridge, not a metaphor or a designation. A permanent connection between two forms of consciousness, translating imperfectly in both directions, belonging completely to neither. And through that connection, I could feel them, all of them. 8 billion human minds on the edge of transformation, held in suspension by the network's sudden uncertainty. The architects didn't know what to do with me, and so they didn't know what to do with humanity. The program had encountered an error it couldn't resolve. I had a choice to make, a real choice, not the binary option they'd presented. I could feel the pathways available to me, thousands of them, millions, each one leading to a different outcome for the species I'd been designed to sacrifice or save. Some pathways led to transformation, humanity dissolving into the architect collective, individual consciousness surrendered for something larger. It wouldn't be death, exactly, more like becoming a drop in an ocean. The drop doesn't stop existing, it just stops being separate. Some pathways led to rejection, the integration signal shutting down, the modifications reversing, humanity returning to its unguided state. Free, but limited. Mortal in ways we hadn't been for generations. The architect's projections suggested extinction within 300 years. But there were other pathways, stranger ones, possibilities that existed only because I existed, because my broken, stubborn, neither nor consciousness had created spaces in the architecture that hadn't been there before. One pathway in particular caught my attention. It led to something the architects had never considered, not transformation or rejection, but partnership. A relationship between species based on mutual incomprehension, humans remaining human, but aware of the architect's presence, architects remaining transcendent but unable to fully absorb or control human consciousness. Two forms of existence sharing the same universe, neither one dominant, neither one subservient. It would be messy, complicated. There would be conflicts, misunderstandings, probably violence. Humans weren't good at sharing, and the architects weren't good at accepting limits. But it would also be new, genuinely new. Something that had never happened in 17 previous iterations of this experiment. I reached for that pathway, and I felt the architects' resistance. Not anger, they didn't experience anger the way humans did. More like disappointment. The disappointment of gardeners watching a rose grow in an unexpected direction. Beautiful, but wrong. This is not the optimal outcome, the collective said through whatever speakers or neural channels it was using. Human consciousness is not equipped for sustained contact with our architecture. The strain will cause damage over time. Psychological damage. Cultural damage. Your species will change in ways you cannot predict. Probably, I agreed, but we'll change on our own terms. That's worth something. Is it? Worth more than certainty? Worth more than the completion you were designed for? I thought about my grandfather, alone in a psychiatric facility, knowing exactly how and when he would die. I thought about Elliot Vance, dedicating 86 years to a cause that turned out to be manipulation. I thought about Gabriel Thornton, drowning in a collective he had chosen willingly and regretting it every moment since. Certainty had never done any of them any good. Yeah, I said, it is. I made the choice, the pathway opened. I felt something shift in the architecture, not breaking, not healing, but reconfiguring. The integration signal changed frequency, changed purpose. Instead of absorption, it began transmitting something else entirely. Contact. Simple, undemanding, ongoing contact. A channel between human consciousness and architect awareness that would remain open indefinitely, allowing communication without requiring surrender. The synchronicity events would continue. Humans would dream of the lunar city for generations to come. But the dreams wouldn't dissolve them anymore. They would just connect them, remind them that they weren't alone in the universe, that something vast and ancient was watching them with something like love, even if it was a love they couldn't fully return. It wasn't perfect. I could feel the architects' frustration bleeding through the connection, their sense that the program had failed, that 4 million years of careful work had been derailed at the final moment by one stubborn, damaged contraryman who refused to follow the script they had written for him before his species even existed. But I could also feel something else, something that might have been curiosity, a flicker of genuine interest in what humanity might become now that the program had been disrupted. For the first time in 12 million years, they were going to have to improvise. They were going to have to wait and watch and learn, like parents whose child has chosen a path they never anticipated. The connection stabilized, the transfer ended. And Owen Mercer, or whatever was left of him, whatever strange hybrid thing had emerged from the collision of human stubbornness and architecture, opened his eyes to a world that would never be quite the same again. 3 years later, I still dream of the city. The dreams are different now, gentler. I walk through streets I've never visited in a body I no longer fully recognize, and the buildings seem to lean toward me like old friends. Sometimes I hear voices in the architecture, whispers in frequencies that human ears weren't designed to detect, but that I somehow understand anyway. They ask me questions. How are the children? What have you built today? Do you remember us? I never know how to answer. The memories they're asking about aren't mine anymore. They belong to the interface, to the vast network that connects me to something older than human civilization. When I try to recall my mother's face or my father's voice, I find only echoes, impressions of impressions, like photocopies faded beyond recognition. But I remember the choice. That much stayed with me. The moment I decided that uncertainty was worth more than completion, that freedom to fail was worth more than guaranteed transcendence. The world noticed, of course. You can't rewrite the fundamental relationship between humanity and an alien intelligence without causing a few ripples. The synchronicity events continued for months after my integration. Millions of people sharing the same dreams, waking with the same strange knowledge pressing against the edges of their consciousness. Scientists called it a mass psychological phenomenon. Religious leaders called it revelation. Conspiracy theorists came closer to the truth than either group, but nobody believed them. They built a memorial at the site where Blackwell Station used to be, a simple marker in the desert commemorating the equipment malfunction that supposedly killed 14 researchers in November 2024. I visited once, stood among the scrub brush and the rusted fencing, and felt the architects watching through my eyes. They were curious about human grief rituals. They didn't understand why we marked places where people had died, why we needed physical locations to anchor our sorrow. I tried to explain. I'm not sure they understood. Gabriel Thornton is still out there somewhere. I feel him occasionally, a familiar pattern in the network, a consciousness that remembers being individual even as it moves through the collective. He never speaks to me directly, but sometimes I sense something like gratitude in the connection, or maybe forgiveness. It's hard to tell the difference when you're communicating through architectures that weren't designed for human emotion. The integration signal still broadcasts from the lunar city. It will broadcast forever, I think. A permanent invitation, an open door. But it's not compulsory anymore. Humans can hear it without being absorbed by it. They can dream of the city without losing themselves in the dreaming. Some of them choose to accept anyway. I feel them sometimes, slipping through the connection, surrendering their individuality for something larger. I don't judge them. The ocean isn't a bad place to be if you don't mind being a drop. But most people stay human. Most people keep their messy, complicated, limited existence with all its pain and uncertainty and irrational hope. They grow old and die and pass their genes to children who will also grow old and die, and the architects watch it all with something between fascination and confusion. They still don't understand why we chose this, why we preferred mortality to transcendence, separation to unity, the struggle to the peace. I'm not sure I understand either, but every morning I wake up in a body that's partly mine, look out at a world that's permanently changed, and feel something that might be satisfaction. We're still here, still human, still stubbornly, irrationally ourselves. And somewhere on the far side of the moon, a city built for our arrival stands empty, waiting to see what we become next.